Hello and welcome on into the Beer Ladies podcast. I'm your friendly neighborhood bean together with Thandi and Lisa. Hi.
Hello.
For yeast. It's an episode on yeast. Our little podcast is slowly but surely becoming a thing, growing and dividing and conquering and making more episodes now that you can find on Overcast and all the pod places, and you can share and rate and subscribe, and you can tweet on over at Beer Ladies Pod because there's not enough letters for Beer Ladies Podcast. And you can come and Facegrams at Beer Ladies Podcast, and you can watch our lovely faces on YouTube at Beer Ladies Podcast, and we're even working on our website so that the show notes will have a happy little home to be cozy, so you can come and listen there. And so what are we drinking there today in Podland? Thandi, what's in your glass?
Woohoo! Okay, so since we're talking about yeast, I found myself picking between different sort of yeast known or yeast forward styles. I was torn between my home brewed Weiss, but then I found a Belgian blonde. So I went for a good old Leffe, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Please don't shoot me, but it's a Leffe blonde, and it's just one of those kind of sure wins. And yeah, it's delicious, absolutely delicious.
It's a gorgeous one. It's tried, tested, and true, and summery, and consistent, and
wonderful.
I think I said Leffe, or maybe Leff. I don't know. Potato.
Could be either.
Lisa, what's new in the land of dark mild?
Well, no dark mild today, although I did still have one to put in my fridge. But sticking with an Irish beer, but again with a sort of Belgian quality. I've got the Atomium from Metalman. So this is their Belgian amber. It's got a bit of a kick to it. It's 7.2%, so it's more of a sipping beer, but definitely, again, was trying to look for something that was going to have a really distinctive, very, very yeast influenced, or obviously yeast influenced, maybe we'll say, character. So far so good. And I'll hold up the actual beer itself too. It's a lovely sort of straw gold color. So very, very nice, and definitely gets a lot of those kind of, a lot of those lovely sort of scents. You do get a lot of that sort of, banana, cloves, all those things you get in, sort of your classic Belgian styles, and but quite dry too. So it's really good, but definitely has a lot of those phenols we like to talk about. But definitely we'll dive into some of that as we go through. But how about yourself, Bean?
Ooh, I'm rocking a Western Herd. Got a Siege Pale Ale because
show it to our.
They've brought this into being using. Where's the camera? House yeast.
Oh, you've even got a matching glass. I'm proud of you.
Yeah, our glassware game is strong here at Beer Ladies Podcast.
Show us your can there.
Oh yeah,
for those watching on YouTube.
Yes, indeed. Here we go.
Ooh. Western Herd have got such lovely branding, don't they?
They really do. I love how it's all very consistent, but they have those variations in the color. It's very distinctive.
Yep. Cascade, Citra, Amarillo. 5.1%. Water from our farm. Hops, house yeast, malted barley from Ireland, and wheat. And it's got a little bit of funk, but nothing overly, just manageable. It's a balanced little bit of funk. So
yum.
Yeah, I can get behind this. I'm delighted with myself. So yeah, I'm really, really excited for yeast because it's so you can't see it. It's too little, just one cell each most of the time, swimming around, making sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide, and just being a little tiny superhero. So
it's absolutely the superhero of beer, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. So I'll just quickly say kind of here's what to Google. It's mostly today we're talking in about yeast about Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is saccharin, sugar, and myces, if it ends in myces, it's a fungus. So we're probably talking about fungi or fungi. And I think you're allowed to choose if you say fungi or fungi. So
I agree.
So yeah, we'll start with why do we care and what are they used for? And then we can devolve into how to care for them and why are they the way they are, and yeah, what makes them tick. So Thandi, do you want to talk about some differences between like yeast strains and flavors for us and stuff?
Okay, so this is something that is just, I don't know, it's so cool about beer because, you know, even if you only have 4 ingredients, you know, malt, water, hops, and yeast, your yeast is just, it is just one of the most fundamental decisions you have to make when you're brewing a beer. And it's one of those things that really divides drinkers. So people like specific styles, and a lot of it has got to do with the yeast. And the biggest separation between the different kinds of yeast that there are ale yeasts and lager yeasts. So that's like the really big divide. The differences between ale yeast and lager yeast are, they're actually not as split as they used to be, or as what people always thought they were. But the big distinction is that ale yeasts are brewed warmer and they're top fermenting, which just means that once they're active, the yeast kind of float to the top and then they eat all the sugars from there until they eventually drop down. Now, lager yeast, you ferment it colder, sort of 8 to 12 degrees Celsius, and it's bottom fermenting. So it works from the bottom, eating its way up, and it stays on the bottom. So if you think of kind of any style of beer, it's generally going to fall into one of those 2 camps, and that's generally dictated by the yeast. So it's even weird because the ones that you think aren't an ale or aren't a lager often are, and there's a little bit of like mindfuckery that can happen when it comes to yeast. So there are some outliers like California Common, which is its own style, and it's got its own kind of yeast, which is really a lager yeast that ferments at ale temperatures. So ale temperatures are typically warmer, around 16 to 24 degrees. 20 degrees is around their happy place, and again, depending on what you're trying to go for. But then there is even like more outliers, which are ale yeast, but that ferment really, really hot, and that's kveik. Now, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I promise you I Googled a Norwegian person saying this word, saying this pronunciation, and the way I'm trying to remember is that it sounds like Viking, it's kveik. So
I think that's fair.
Yeah. So kveik is again, an umbrella term. It's a group of yeasts that were used historically in Norway and Scandinavia, but Norwegian farmhouse yeast is really what it's kind of called, or how it's known. And it ferments really, really hot. So it's almost 35 to 40 degrees Celsius, which is very warm for a yeast. So if those are the 2 big splits between ale and lager, even though there are a couple of outliers or a couple of hybrids, there are some styles that are really well known because of their yeasts. And so one of them would be your wheat beers. So Weiss, Wit, and even Saisons, which are not only wheat beers and they don't even have to have wheat in them, but those are kind of almost Belgian-y, French, German, sort of very European centric beers, and they're often known for their yeast characteristics. You get, I mean, still within them, you'll get things like a Bock, which is a dark lager, almost a strong dark lager, a Baltic porter, a porter that is fermented with a lager yeast and then lagered for a long time. And then, of course, you get what we spoke about a couple of weeks ago, which is sours. So those are a totally different strain of yeast, as we spoke about there. And please go back and listen to that episode if you're interested in sour beers. But really, just to kind of sum up, there's ale lager, there's ale yeast and lager yeast, just like there are ale beers and lager beers, although Christina has still yet to explain to me which came first properly, ale or beer. And I'm sure Lisa will fill me in. But there are certain beers that have got certain characteristics that come directly from the yeast. So a lot of the Belgian styles, if you talk about like the Belgian blonde that I'm drinking, that comes, it's very, very, the flavor that comes from it, that the warmth, the spiciness. Spiciness is often what we think of as phenolic, which is phenols, which is clovey, spicy, hot, spicy, warm. Those come from the yeast. And then in your Weiss or your Wit beers, in your Weiss, that banana that you get from it is an ester that comes directly from the yeast. In your Wit beers, where it's coriander and orange, comes from the yeast. And again, clove, your phenolics come from your yeast. So there's so much to talk about when it comes to yeast, but that is kind of the overall landscape. Lisa, what are you going to tell us now about how we even discovered yeast and why it's important?
Yes, and a very, very good question, because it's, while we have a very clear sort of date at which we know, we being kind of white men who are important, again, in air quotes, people have known, obviously, that there was something else involved in helping to ferment their beer. And again, like we talked about in our sour episode, obviously there's the open fermentation where you just kind of put stuff out and hope for the best. But we do know that all, throughout kind of the history of beer making, and I think it's really interesting to tie to some of the sort of Scandinavian and sort of Finnish farmhouse styles, because we have really good evidence for how they would continue to propagate their yeast with either these, I'll try to show a picture, but we'll put this in the show notes. They had yeast logs, and we think about the Vikings having sort of magic brewing sticks, where again you would stir, as you're doing your work there. It's all just kind of in there. Obviously, it's getting all those good yeast, and some of them are still alive, just kind of hanging out for a long time. So these would be passed down in families, or potentially also, you get a lot of nonsense written as well. So I know Christina's not here, but I'm going to say there's a lot of ritual where people be like, oh, it was magic. It's like, well, they think it was magic, or were they just like, this is the thing I use and I know it's important. So again, that doesn't make it not cool, but it may not have been as sort of unexpected and again, sort of magical to people as we might think. But then you do get then going into sort of 17th, 18th century, these yeast logs or these sort of yeast wreaths. And again, we have really good evidence for these things, especially in Scandinavia, Northern Europe. There are probably, and the article we'll link in the show notes, suggests there are a lot more in museums, maybe folk museums, that are just not correctly labeled because people didn't know what they were if they hadn't been involved. But again, these are things that you'd be using in your brewing process. You'd keep them and you'd use them again. So essentially, like your sourdough starter, you've got the same thing going on there. And I think, Bean, you're probably going to sort of get more into that. But then when we get into the sort of industrial brewing, numbers, men doing important science, it's still a very, very interesting story, because it's, again, there's this idea, people didn't know what they were doing. The Reinheitsgebot doesn't mention yeast. Of course it doesn't, because they didn't know there were these, happy little organisms doing their thing. But again, they knew something was happening. And there was, of course, as you get to that sort of more industrial era, you're trying to keep your quality up. You're trying to, brew on an industrial scale. And if you're getting bad microbes in, or you're getting, a sort of rogue yeast in, that reputation is going to spread. People don't want to buy your peculiar, your potentially more expensive lager beer. So we do first get von Leeuwenhoek actually discovers yeast cells when he's first, putting together the initial microscopes, but he doesn't know it's alive. He doesn't quite know what it is. He's just like, oh, there's that. And if you want to go down a whole rabbit hole, you can look at all the things he looked up under his early microscopes. It's a whole thing, but less around yeast, but very interesting. But then, we get Louis Pasteur, who's like, aha, I have this whole idea. He really kind of does figure out in 1857, there is yeast. It's a thing. And he goes to the French brewing industry, not the wine industry, but the brewing industry. So again, think about that and what that might mean, why we don't think about the French brewing industry as much these days. And they're like, nah, they're just not particularly interested, even though he's like, but I will give it to you for the nation. And they're like, whatevs. So, yeah. So instead, we get Emil Hansen, who's a chemist at Carlsberg. And in 1883, so again, we have this sort of 25-odd-year gap where we know what it is. We start to figure out it's a thing that's alive, and it's a thing you have to kind of keep happy. That's when Hansen is really able to figure out, oh, I can isolate it. I can clone it. I can keep propagating this initial strain. And that's why we do then get the Saccharomyces carlsbergensis, which for a long time people were like, that is lager yeast. Now, again, gets a little more complicated because maybe they're not so different after all. Maybe they're really all kind of different versions of kind of the same thing. But it's really that, Carlsberg are the first brewery that really figured this out and realized we should invest in science. And if you go to the Carlsberg tour, which when travel is a thing again, highly, highly recommend, go to Copenhagen, go to the Carlsberg tour, because they've preserved his lab and they've all sort of set it up as essentially a museum exhibit, but they completely understand a lot of our success, which obviously carries on to the modern day, is because we figured out the science and we invested in it and continue to do that. And I think, and we'll probably come back to this, there's something really important about then how you have kind of, you know, your kind of house yeast and what that character is. There are certainly breweries that I love because I just really get along with their house yeast, and others where I'm like, it's not for me. It can have such a huge impact, this tiny, tiny thing. And you think too how more and more breweries, you know, really get, oh, you know, this is where we have to invest in, is in kind of the, you know, the quality, you know, the science side. It's keeping that yeast happy, because if it goes off, you're kind of stuck. And it's not like, I was going back through some of my old homebrew books where it's like, look, just rock up to your local brew pub. They'll be happy to give you all the yeast for you to brew whatever you want at home. And I was like, that's adorable. And I remember when that was a thing that happened, and you can certainly still, you know, get your yeast out of your Duvel bottle or your Orval bottle or whatever. You could still do that, but I don't think people are quite as willing to be like, please take our scientific intellectual property and you do you with it. No, yeah, it's not that, there's not that much free love anymore. So
they'd be safe enough with me. I wouldn't be able to do much with it at all.
And I think there are still plenty of places who are like, yeah, sure, why not? But I think enough to like, we've invested a lot in this. No, you go buy it. And I think as we'll get to, it's so relatively easy now to buy a really specific yeast to get exactly what that quality is you're looking for if you're home brewing. So much easier now.
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously a complete myth that yeast was always just available in a little sachet or a little vial. So it is one of those things, like almost back in tracking back there, Lisa, that people knew what yeast was. They just didn't know that they knew it did something, and they knew that there was something there. So it wasn't magical in the way that I actually revere it now. I think it's complete magic, but magic is just something that you don't know what it's called or how it works, right? So, you know, it's one of those things that people knew about grains or fruits fermenting for many, many years before anybody gave it a name. And there is still that raging debate as to whether beer came first, wine came first, bread came first, you know, and how that goes on. I'm sure, Lisa, you've probably got some more updated knowledge on that. Yes, or opinion. Yay! Because I really want to believe it's because of beer, but you know, I won't temper my
or maybe mead. So
yeah, or mead. Didn't even think of mead, exactly. So I mean, what we spoke about in the sours episode is that there are so many wild yeasts floating around in the air. They're on everything. They're on fruits. They're on plants. They're on your grains. They're on absolutely everything. So initially, it was probably that everybody just fermented with whatever was going around. And that would explain a lot of the sort of farmhouse ales, I guess, and the fact that people could pass on their yeasts, and it was absolutely precious. That's in the case of saisons. It's also in the case of Vike. It's in a bunch of different places, and not even just Europe. It would probably be all over the world in its own variety. So yeast was well known, even if it didn't have a name, or even if it wasn't completely manipulated. Right? Nowadays, we are so lucky that we can go to a homebrew shop and just go, you know, scrolling through, you know, almost hundreds of different yeasts depending on your supply, and you can just be like, oh cool, I want to brew this, I'll do that, instead of cultivating it and keeping it alive. And I mean, yes, one of those things that I think it's really cool. And as a home brewer, like, I love the selection, but I revere at the amount of effort and scientific discovery that went into making something like that little packet as stable and as long lasting as it is now, and as easy to consume. It's I don't know. I think it's incredible. Yeast is awesome.
Absolutely. And when that's the other thing too, you do get these yeasts that are sort of lying dormant in things for sometimes hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. And that's fascinating. Like, you can sort of reanimate the yeast in a lot of cases. A beer I used to love that I used to get all the time was Flag Porter, which was one where it was yeast from a shipwreck. And I'm just looking up to see when the shipwreck was. The shipwreck was 1825. And it was just a really, really good beer. And you know, again, I think whenever you're brewing a sort of historic beer, it's still going to be different in some way. Hops are different, you know, the grains are different. There's just you're going to get a different yield from what you're brewing. But to be able to use a yeast that is that old, that you've been able to kind of wake up, it's just cool. And it gives a really interesting, unique flavor. And when there are like the recent genetic studies on yeast trying to sort of trace them back, they don't make sense in air quotes necessarily. And that's, I think, more interesting than if it was a sort of clear, oh, well, we know people in Anatolia were making things, or people in Western China, whatever. I like that it doesn't quite match up, because then it's like, are we missing pieces of evidence, or is there just something that's much bigger and way cooler that we haven't thought of? So
yeah, exciting
times.
Yeah, absolutely.
And actually, like if you I've got a lovely book about the natural history of wine by Ian Tattersall and Rob DeSalle, and they go through like how if you take some wild strains of yeast, I think they were talking specifically about Saccharomyces paradoxus. It's quite clear in the DNA typing where that strain of yeast came from. But Saccharomyces cerevisiae that humans have taken around with them, their genes are all mixed up over different parts of the world, because we've traveled and we've taken our fermented products with us, and so like their different genomes are a little bit mixed up because we've traveled around with them.
Absolutely.
It just shows you how important. Oh, sorry, Lisa.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, just to that point, I can't remember if it was South America or somewhere in the Pacific where a lot of the genes come from, and people are like, what? It's like, but took boats and went all over the place. So it's, you know, it's just, again, you have to sort of think, what does the evidence say, instead of having this sort of, you know, very Western white narrative about, this happens. Like, no, everyone traveled all the time, and that's what's so interesting, is there's this huge, just it's always been passing back and forth. It's fascinating.
I was reading an article, but I don't think I'm confident enough to actually keep it here, which we'll probably edit out, but there was an article about like specific yeast strains that were found almost everywhere in the world except for Europe. And I thought, wow, how cool is that? Because we've also got a very like European-centric view of like yeast, how it was discovered and how it's used. And it really isn't. I mean, you can find almost this strain of yeast between the Americas, Africa, and Asia and Australasia, but you don't find it in Europe. And I thought that's so cool.
Yeah, that is so interesting. And especially like thinking about different traditional brewing techniques in, I want to say especially East Africa is kind of what's coming to mind now, because some of those traditions carried on, like, again, kind of similar to some of the brewing stick idea, you know, using, you know, keeping the yeast alive. It's just like, you know, how come that kind of fell out of favor in a lot of Europe, but it was maintained in other places clearly, and it's fascinating.
This idea of a yeast stick is actually really fascinating to me. I didn't know a lot about it before preparing for this episode, but looking at Kvike and how it was passed down in these sort of Norwegian farmhouse ales and between families and whatnot. I mean, it's, as you say, Lisa, it was like a thing that you'd use while brewing, and it would collect a bit of your yeast and whatnot, and then it would sit and dry, like in the brew house or in the shed, or well, not the shed, but you know, in wherever the brewing was taking place, and it would be warm enough, because Kvike needs to be warm, like 30 to 40 degrees or so. It would dry out. You could either keep it on there just dried, or you could then, like in today's sort of world, you could almost take it, put it onto like a baking sheet and put it into your oven at 30 degrees, and it becomes like flakes, and then you can rehydrate and use it again. So it's one of those things that I think we've become very very throwaway and very convenience led when it comes to brewing with yeast at a homebrew scale. So we buy a packet of yeast, and it's like a million little things, little dots of stuff. You rehydrate it, you pitch it, and then you take all of that slurry at the end of it and you just kind of throw it away. Meanwhile, you could really keep it, and if you wanted to, you could freeze it, you could dry it, you can do a bunch of things that you almost never have to buy yeast again. You know, the idea that you have to buy yeast for every single brew is absurd. It's just that it does take a little bit of maintenance and care to be able to harvest it and keep it happy, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, like good sourdough starter or whatever. Same thing. You have to keep it, keep it happy, or at least keep it sort of in stasis. One of the two, and it's depending on what kind of yeast it is and all those things that may be achieved in different ways. But I think too, we'd be remiss in an episode about yeast to not use my favorite brewing word, which is associated with yeast, which is flocculation, because it's just such a good word. I mean, flocculation. Wonderful.
So I have completely stolen a few different articles mention sort of how to choose the right yeast for your beer.
And does it talk about flocculating, which is like clumping together and falling out of solution? And
indeed, so there are let's say 6 different things that you want to look for if choosing a yeast for your beer, and that it will go to tasting, but I think we should talk maybe about interesting styles that have yeast forward profiles after this. But if you're brewing styles and you're looking for a yeast to use, I think the number one thing that you're going to look for is what style is your beer? What style are you going for? You'd use a very different yeast for like an American light lager as you would for an Irish stout, as you would for a saison. So there are, you almost know where you're going to go based on the style that you're looking at, but then you can go deeper. So you can go into attenuation, which is basically how much sugar does it eat? So some yeasts will only eat partial amounts and it'll leave sweetness behind. Some yeast will eat all of it and it will be quite dry. So imagine a saison is often quite dry, and a stout is often quite sweet. So that will have to do with the attenuation of those yeasts. Then you've got flocculation. So, does it drop down and clarify the beer, or does it stay suspended? So partially, something like a Weiss is and its haziness is due partially to the flocculation of that yeast, the low flocculation of the yeast. It's also got to do with the high protein content of wheat malt. So it's a little bit of a combination. It's why you can also get hazy IPAs, because the protein, something like oats or wheat, will contribute to that. But you can also get clear Weiss beers, like a crystal Weiss is clarified. So there's different ways that you can play with it. I love brewing; it's amazing. So then the other thing is alcohol tolerance. So alcohol tolerance will tell you whether your yeast can handle high or low ABV beers, and for instance, a high sort of thing is maybe like a barley wine or something like that, which it needs to eat a shit ton of sugar before it's done, and it's going to take a while because there's a lot there. Okay, so that's sort of a yeast. Either you increase the amount that it's the amount that you're pitching, or you choose a yeast based on its ability to handle a lot of sugar versus low, which is cream ales, light lagers, blonde beers, those kinds of things. Temperature range is pretty much fundamental to the style, or as we know it, but it's also fundamental to how you choose yeast because of your own equipment. If you can't control your temperature of fermentation, if you can't maintain, let's say, 10 degrees or 8 degrees for a lager, there's no point in choosing a lager to brew. It's just not going to work, because when you stress yeast out, it gives you all sorts of bad things. But when you keep it within its ranges, it's phenomenal. So then the other thing is the sensory profile. So this is, for me, where it's quite interesting. So the sensory profile is kind of the slightly more subjective part of what yeast gives, but there are things that yeast gives off. So esters, which are fruity notes, fruity aromas, fruity flavors; phenols, which are spicy notes, spicy aromas; and then fusel alcohols, which are warmth. And yeah, is there anything more to fusels there, Lisa, that I could be missing something?
Kind of where I go. Yeah, because I think of that like alcohol heat or that.
Yes,
that warmth, yeah.
And it's weird because, again, depending on the style that you're looking at, drinking or brewing, some things will be in style and some things will be out of style. So having warmth in like a lager is a terrible idea. It would be off, totally off. Why on earth would you need that? But having warmth within a Belgian blonde is on style, as long as it's moderate, not high. So there are things that you'd look at then in terms of the yeast that you choose to brew with, and it would be according to the style, the attenuation, the flocculation, alcohol tolerance, temperature range, and the sensory profile. The biggest sensory sort of thing I can think of is like, especially with a Weiss, you know, to get those banana and clove notes. For me, it's really interesting because if you, depending on the yeast that you choose, you can also tweak it a little bit to your liking with the temperature that you ferment at. So if you ferment slightly warmer, 18, 19, 20, 21 degrees, you can get more banana. If you are fermenting lower, so 18, 17, 16, 15, you can get more phenolic, so that your clove and your spicy notes. So not only does yeast have its own range, and often it's quite big, but it can be manipulated depending on what you're trying to do to your own tastes, which is really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And think of the impact too, not just on those flavors and those aromas, but on the mouthfeel too, because when you do get those phenolics, you can get that kind of oily character as well, which can be good or can be too much. And again, you have to kind of tweak and you know, see what you're doing. Or again, talking about something like a wheat beer where you can get that soft, you know, or now with all the hazy IPAs, that sort of soft character. And it's, again, that's all, you know, what's your protein, what's your yeast, how are they playing together? So
yeah,
fascinating.
Yeah. It's really, really cool because all of the different flavors that yeast can lend to your beer, like they change. So some of the flavors that you might get from a yeast are very clean, which is typically your sort of American ales, IPAs, pale ales. You know, you often want like the hops to shine rather than the yeast. Then you get, let's say, more of the British yeasts, which often have things like diacetyl, which is a butterscotch, that it will allow, let's say, more diacetyl to be produced, which is more accepted within British styles of beer. But they're also quite fruity. So if you imagine a fruit with almost a butterscotchy, toffee kind of flavor, you know, that comes from the way that the yeast works with the grains, with the hops, and everything else. And then of course you get the Belgians, which are, you can almost tell when somebody's tried to brew a Belgian style beer but they don't have it right. Like you can tell, because there's just something, isn't there, about a Belgian beer, regardless of the style. You can smell it and you can taste it, and it's been cultivated over many years.
Yeah, I always think of one. I will not say where it was, many years ago, but it was you know, advertised as a double, and I was like, I like a double. It was fall, you know, cool weather. Just thought this would be lovely, and you get it, and oh no, I was like, oh honey, no. But again, like it had all these like weird, inappropriate phenolics, and again, your double can have all that sort of candy sugar, that sweetness, but your yeast needs to go in and do some things about that. It can still have that, but it was just like you say, it was like they're like, we'll make it Belgian and dark, and that'll be a double. And you're like, no.
It doesn't work that way. I mean, you could take the same ingredients, you know, the same grain bill, the same hop bill, the same water profile, and you can change just the yeast, and you'll get vastly different beers. So it's one of those things that it's not important for every single style, but there are certain styles that it is very important for. And so, yeah, Belgian ales or Belgian beers in general, very, very important. And
absolutely,
yeah.
And I think that clean profile is one that, you know, I love, you know, especially when I'm in the mood for just a clean, crisp lager, clean pale ale. You know, think of how modern that is, like how hard that is to actually achieve consistently. And sometimes we like really slate brewers who do it. Like people will be like, oh, Sierra Nevada always does that, so it's boring. It's like, no, guys, they've invested so much in like getting this right over all this time and cultivating that yeast for, you know, 40 odd years at this point. And, you know, that clean profile can easily kind of start going off in another direction if it's not, you know, consistently tested, you know, and again, that propagation of that same house character, that's no easy feat. So I think, you know, some of the, I think we have it less here in Ireland, but you certainly see it in the States and to a certain extent in Canada. I've seen it as well, where it's like, oh, well, they're too big, so now they're not that, you know, they're not as interesting or whatever. You're like, well, but that's not bad. It's just bigger. So all good to drink local, but it's also nice to be like, well, they've succeeded in, you know, changing the market. And again, doing it with that kind of quality control, that's a hard thing. So.
Absolutely. There's one other kind of yeast that I just want to touch on, lest we forget it, and that is a fairly, I don't want to say fairly recent, but it is fairly recent, a new and up and coming variety of yeast, which is the kinds of yeast that you use if you bring a non-alcoholic beer. So
yeah.
we touched on this now in our non-alcoholics episode, that there are different ways to produce a non-alcoholic beer, and typically yeast use was not one of those ways. But increasingly, there are varieties of yeast that are being created and modified to be able to, I don't know what they do, but they're eating the sugar, but they're limiting their output of alcohol and carbon dioxide, I guess. So I'm not sure what they're doing with the rest of the byproducts, or if they're like, I don't know what's happening with them.
Constipated yeast.
Yeah.
Is it that they were eating one kind of sugar but not another kind, so a lot of that was staying in?
Could be. But I think the point is to still try and get the same dryness and the same lack of sweetness as you'd get with a normal Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but with a different variety of it. So I think that there's a lot of cool stuff that's happening in that area right now, even if we don't know all of the technicalities of it yet. But that is quite an interesting slant, because yeast, what we obviously found with a lot of non-alcoholic beers is that they're very sweet, they taste very worty, very unfermented, and that's not really what you want in a beer. In beer, you're looking for balance, and there's always a play of the ingredients. But with the kinds of yeasts and the kind of almost genetic manipulation that we can look at now, there's a lot to be said for cool yeasts that could come up. And along with the kveik, which is an ancient yeast, but has been, let's say, resuscitated and popularized, not just because it can withstand high temperatures, but actually because it works really quickly. Like, you're looking at a fully fermented beer within about 3 days, which is incredible compared to the sort of 14 days you'd look at for other beers. So that's part of the reason, I think, why commercially it would be something to invest in looking at those kinds of yeasts.
Wow.
For those who are listening, Fee made a great face. It was amazing.
That is because my mind is blown.
It's cool though, hey? Like, actually what I like is that it's ancient. It's like at least traced back to the 1600s, the use of kveik. And like, now everybody is going absolutely bananas over it, and but it makes sense. Exactly.
Oh, yeah, what's old is new again.
And
absolutely.
And there's different strains again, so you could again choose, and some of them will produce different kind of esters, so you might get like orange and grapefruit and apple and melon and various flavors from them, and others are slightly cleaner. Now, I've never brewed with it because my house is way too cold to brew the kveik yeast. Like, it's not going to happen. It's unfortunate.
Just wait till the summer.
It'll still be too cold.
No.
But I do have some friends, like homebrew friends, who have brewed with it, and they enjoy using it. And I think that there's a lot of potential in these outliers of the different kinds of yeast. So whether it's a yeast that can be used really hot, or whether it's a yeast that can be used really cold, or a yeast that can be used at whatever temperature you want it to be. Like, I think those are really interesting developments.
Absolutely. And I think too, like the crossovers with distilling as well, like what's happening in that world from a yeast perspective, that I think is fascinating. And especially, like you say, what if you start traveling to other places where, again, from the kind of European perspective, people aren't thinking, well, what yeast do you use when you're making baijiu or something like that? Like, what would happen if you start to kind of mix some of these things together? I think and again, it might not happen kind of the first generation, but you can play around with those yeasts and kind of introduce them to other yeast friends and, see if they get along, and they may not. And that's okay too. But there's so much you can do and kind of play around in the lab and kind of be a mad scientist and see what you turn up with. And again, I think to look at some of these other traditions around the world where maybe there are these sort of long-term propagations of yeast that either haven't been recognized because the right people weren't looking at it, or just kind of were seen as such a sort of normal domestic task. It was like, oh, that's the thing women did. Who cares? But, to start to kind of dig some of these up and put them together, like there's again, like you said, like yeast has traveled with us, for millennia. Like, what if we just kind of, started harvesting it from other places and just throwing it in and seeing what happens? I think that would be tons of fun.
And you guys did a great job on sours episode, and you were talking about like some of the German sours, the Goses, and the like Belgian, more like the the gooses and the lambics, and like they're more kind of open. The whole vat is a stir stick style.
Yeah.
Yeah, and think about how that's becoming much more popular now. So many people are investing in their having a giant cool ship, which, you know, you can do if you have enough capital to like separate that from the rest of your brewery. And but it's funny how that was seen as so sort of this dying art, and now it's been revived. But what will that mean in the long term? I think that's a really interesting question. As we get more and more of these sort of wild yeasts that at a certain point won't really be wild anymore. They'll just be kind of part of the terroir. So I don't know, what do you call them? I don't know, feral? Maybe.
Yeah, there's like the captive ones that we captured, and there's a cute little I'll link just a couple of minutes of Alton Brown on Good Eats with sock puppets being, these are the captive yeasts, just because it's cute. But yeah, I think there's definitely a growing interest in people saying like, I'm just gonna do like open fermentation, but that may not be always possible or advisable.
Yeah, if I were to go like, you know, stick a tank out in my back garden in Dublin 1, I don't know that would be good. I don't think so. But
you know what I think would happen though is that it's never good the first time, and it takes the reuse and the refinement of it, and it's open, but you've got to be able to manage it somehow. I don't know how that happens, because for me, open fermentation feels like controlled chaos, and I have no idea how to approach it. And I admire anybody that does it. But like I think you could do it if you were patient enough to like really dial it in and see what happened, and realize that probably 10 or 12 batches are just going to be utter shite. Like
yeah, the first batch will be like really, really slow. Yeah, and then you have to kind of take notes and just be super patient and see how it goes.
Run into terrible things like a stuck fermentation and all these just weird things. But yeah.
Lisa, if we go back to the Reinheitsgebot, okay? So for those who don't know what that was German brewing rules, effectively, of what could go into a beer. So it was water, yeast, hops.
No yeast.
No yeast. Oh, sorry, no yeast. That was the point.
No yeast.
Yeast was left out. So it was malt, hops, and water.
Yeah, just water, hops, barley. They don't even include wheat, which is interesting.
Yes.
Because
wheat was for the bakers, right?
Pretty much, yeah. And that's the thing, because the Reinheitsgebot was actually, 15, 16, such a small part of what is now Germany. I think technically at that point is still really the Holy Roman Empire, part of it. But it wasn't, it was just this very local thing, and kind of more of a guideline than a rule in a lot of ways. But then like you go to Munich and they'll have it like up, but it's still it's kind of a tourist thing. And I think it's been just kind of wildly overstated. It's really only in Bavaria. And again, they don't include the yeast because they don't know there's something happening, but they're like, to them that's a step in the process, whatever it is. They're not
it's not an ingredient,
even if they are
or
effectively.
were they not not taking a bit of like the previous batch?
That is my assumption, and that's actually something I would be curious to learn more about. And again, because my German is horrific, I'd be curious to know, like, were they just taking something from the previous batch and tossing it in, which makes sense to me, is that you would start each old batch.
Because you would have learned that from like doing sourdough and
sauerkraut even.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, they don't talk about the yeast, but it is also interesting that they don't talk about wheat, because exactly the same thing. Wheat's for baking, that's for your bread, but obviously in other parts of Germany they're making wheat beer.
So is that the distinction? Is that the places that you'd get wheat beers and Weiss beers would not be in the same place as Reinheitsgebot was in place?
Yes, but like it's all a little fuzzy, and there's not, I think, because also people are they're using wheat and rye in baking, but you can also use obviously wheat and rye in brewing, and certainly people were in Germany. And you're not including other things like, again, you're thinking about if they're making a gruit somewhere, what else are they putting in? It could be anything. I mean, and especially if you're thinking about sort of the 16th century, people are putting whatever's around,
whatever's cheap.
You've got fermentable sugars, toss it in. It's all good. So it is a weird thing, but it it has had this impact where these days you go to Germany and it's like lager, like, and they're all good, but I think that's a little overstated, because like, what would a lager have looked like in the 16th century? They were just kind of figuring out that whole thing. It wasn't like they were making these crisp golden lagers at that point. No, they weren't. They were still making these mostly dark beers that would have probably had rye, probably had wheat, all over the place. Yeah, we'll have to do a whole like German beer thing because it's really, really interesting, but it gets sort of trotted out when it's convenient for people. It's that kind of thing.
So I have a question. Lisa, you might be able to help me with this. And if it goes unanswered, then so be it. We'll put it out to the public and maybe we'll do an episode on
maybe
it.
they'll know. Yeah.
So my question is like, it doesn't make sense to me how Kwijk, let's say, which is something that needs to be fermented really, really, really warm, comes from a country that is exceptionally cold, and lagers, which needs to be fermented cold, is very dominant in very warm countries like South Africa. So how on earth is that a thing?
Isn't that interesting? Maybe it's just like whatever was the hardest to do, so it was all a weird flex. Like
caves and saunas, man.
Yeah. The one thing I think of for like Kwijks and that kind of thing is you also have all the satés, and if you're brewing it, traditionally by putting your hot stones in the water, at least like you can kind of control your temperature that way. I did write an article on Kwijk, but it was a long time ago now, so who knows, but I'll have to dig that up. But that is interesting, isn't it? Is it just like what's the hardest to do there, so you can be like, look at me?
Or is it what is going to be the best beer to drink, and irrespective of how it gets brewed? Because look, only from a South African perspective, lagers were obviously very big, and we had SAB, and they were obviously the biggest brewery in the world before AB InBev came and took over and bought them. But lagers were really really a staple, and for a country like South Africa where it's warm and hot most of the year, even in winter, like outside it's warm, lagers make sense because they're really refreshing, and it makes and you drink them cold, even if that's a little bit even outdated, because it's, you don't want to drink your beers at like 0 degrees or 2 degrees. But anyway, it still happens, but it makes sense environmentally. But what doesn't make sense is the fermentation of them, because fermenting a lager or brewing a lager and fermenting it means that you have to have really good temperature control. You can't just ferment a lager at 25 degrees ambient heat. It's going to be all sorts of crazy. And then you still want to age it. You want to ferment a lager, the lager yeast, you want to ferment between 8 and 12 degrees. And then when it's done, you'll raise it a little bit to get the diacetyl out, but then you want to lager it at like 2 to 4 degrees for about a month. So it's not something that you just have lying around in a warm country. So
are there caves though? That's one question. Did they lager in caves? Because they did in the US. Like the German brewers go to the US Midwest in the 1830s, 1840s because there are caves and they can lager. So
interesting.
I don't know.
Like, because lager was one of those colonial imports to South Africa, there's lots of local kinds of beer, but they're not what you call clear beer. They're cloudy, and they're generally using almost a lactobacillus or something to add sourness. There's a lot of like sour styles in South Africa, so it's a colonial import. So I wonder if there wouldn't be something like bringing along casks, kegs, or something to kind of store them in. I don't know, but this is now the 1600s, really.
Yeah. Well, you know what this is to me is post-COVID field trip. We should all, do a big trip to South Africa and
won't say no.
Figure it out. Yeah, you can be our tour guide, and we'll have to
Let's go.
do the definitive book.
Yeah.
Let's go.
It's cool.
And before we go, maybe we can send people vicariously over to the National Collection of Yeast Cultures in England, in Norfolk, and they've got like 4,000 and more strains over there, and you can go and look for them by head formation and head retention and deposits and attenuation, clarity, final product, and flocculence, and they can hook you up with one for a small, maybe a large price, but like there's so much yeast. Do we have any final thoughts about our Ask a My Seat friends before we cut this baby short and get out of here?
How about a question?
Sure.
If you had to pick your favorite like yeast forward or yeast dominated style, what would it be? You go first, Lisa.
Oh, that's a really, really interesting question. For me, it's probably going to be something like Probably like a Belgian Wit, but actually, you know what I'm thinking? Just I'm going to Allagash White, so I'm gonna pick a US beer that's just so clean, refreshing, but has that, you know, just that gorgeous character. And if they would like to start distributing in Ireland, I'd be happy to help that happen. So just putting that out there, guys. We'd be happy to have your beer here. But I think, yeah, something like that where it's just such a great interpretation of the style and just so accessible. And I don't say accessible as like damning with faint praise. It is a gorgeous beer. Just, yeah, I'm going to go for an Allagash White. So Wit beer, just perfect.
Wit beer, lovely choice. Bean, how about you?
Well, actually, I've been really enjoying whatever the house yeast is in the Siege Pale Ale, or I would go for maybe an Otterbank Mad Wild Mixed Saison, whatever, just because it sounds
funky
not?
farmhouse stuff. Yeah.
Yeah,
that's cool. I think on my side, I'd probably go for something like a Saison. I do love Saisons. And I think the yeast character that can come through and how much it can be manipulated is so awesome. So like, I really do like that. Yeah, Saisons are good, but also I love a Weiss. I do love a Weiss. Simple and delicious, and especially a Dunkel Weiss.
Oh, those are so good.
Yes,
so
yes.
good. So
Not enough of them.
They're all so good.
Yeah,
they're all so good. And we want to nom them all. Right, guys. I guess you better get started and answer our questions on the Twitter at Beer Ladies Pod and the Insta Face Tubes and the website at Beer Ladies Podcast, possibly.com. And we are gonna see you next week with more of the Beer Ladies. Because
more of the Beer Ladies.
More the merrier. Thanks for pitching in.
Hi.
Thanks for that, Lisa.
Nice pun.
It's the puns are primary. We know what our priorities are here at the Beer Ladies Podcast. So thank you for coming out. Thanks for spending your time, guys. Thanks for being part of all of life. Life is complicated. Shouts out to the Ascomycetes. And we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.